In the UK, he set up the industry equivalent of the IICRC and became a qualified member of the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. Jeff plays an active role in the industry, both in the UK and USA and European Commission. Welcome, Jeff.
I feel like a gladiator about to enter the arena to face my peers, who probably believe I'm debating a lost cause. I accept there's often a debate where spore traps are legitimate tools for the IEP, and I hope this presentation will show a balanced appraisal of benefits and shortfalls. The IEP has to accommodate the victim or patient requirements within budget constraints. The IEP has to assess risks and hazards usually associated with water damage events. The remediation contractor will require a detailed appraisal to allow formulation of his quotation. The medical and nutritionist professional should ideally have had an input into the scope of the IEP's inspection, but invariably they're only involved once the client sees possible health-related issues identified by the IEP. I should emphasise the client is not a patient of the IEP, and the IEP's role is to provide value for money and practical information which the client can use. The IEP should not recommend detailed sampling and analysis unless identified as suitable in pre-contract discussion or unless requested by qualified competent medics. Typically, basic useful investigations may cost less than $1,500, and most clients would disappear if faced with the additional sampling costs of detailed significance. As with all investigation and treatments, there is a starting point which is a basis for further action. Medics wouldn't start off with a neuroquant or a $1,000 blood analysis, and equally an IEP wouldn't advise all testing and lab protocols in every room. I will show total spore traps are often good indicators of water damage and possible exposure to biohazards. The presentation revolves around the decision-making process of which, what, where and why. The IEP's role is to identify issues which may have resulted in building-related illness. If there is no certainty regarding building-related illness, then additional inspections may be required to other properties, such as the workplace, or even vehicles. Equally, apart from mould, several other contaminants may be present which weren't assessed in the initial basic inspection, and these may require further investigation. The vast majority of clients have budget constraints and invariably reduce the scope of sampling and even treatment. While cholestyramine, glutathione or vitamins may play a role in treatment, they are not the only route or indeed options. Similarly, when an IEP investigates a property, they don't just use ERMI or indeed total spore counts. They will develop a testing and inspection hypothesis based on requirements, information and budget. This is in accordance with the American Congress of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. The objective in this presentation is to show why total spore counts are, in my opinion, seen as an important risk assessment tool. I'm not looking at it as a hazard assessment tool, but a risk assessment tool. I realise there are a few patients where money is no object, but I've never met any of them. Most request limited sampling. Many have previously undertaken DIY testing, but realise the results are meaningless to them. With professional remediation very expensive, most will use a local builder who rarely provide adequate results. Most of the established medical fraternity ignore the issues of SIRS and inflammation, and I've lost count how many sick doctors I have as clients. The most important factor for the majority of my clients is an economic survey, advice, and risk reduction in the hope of improved health. Risks are sometimes assumed And typically a drywall cavity construction, which is saturated from a long-term leak, is almost certain to have a Group 1 tertiary mould growth with associated health risks. I would argue that subject to the client recognising possible building-related illness, the IEP is the most important next step in their return to health. If the cause and source of illness has not been identified and remediated, it is my opinion, treatment is unlikely to succeed to maximum effect if exposure to the inflammagens continues. Clients with the inflammatory response are unlikely to see health improvements without both of these bullet points being fulfilled. The budget sets the criteria for all investigations. Occasionally, I quote a job and the client thinks it's a lot of money. I simply advise them against proceeding because if they think a survey is expensive, wait for the cost of remediation and medical treatment, which is unlikely to be free or even understood on the National Health Service. Some criticise total spore counts because they cannot identify the very important fragments of spores or hyphae, which may count several hundred parts per single spore. Of course, these are very important as they bypass human defences, but the objective is to identify risk areas by genus comparison in conjunction with the basic survey. Even ERMI doesn't separate fragment risk, but calculates them as collective spores. Both sampling protocols miss this important risk assessment for particle size and quantity. The IEP will likely use a 6-channel particle counter to assess high-risk suspect areas for total spore count sampling. Importantly, the spore trap, initially developed to assess dust levels, does identify excess debris loading in the sample. The IEP would usually start with a brief discussion with the client on symptoms and historic events and utilise and consider the shown criteria in order to provide an objective report. This would be followed by a walkthrough to assess and note potential issues and develop a sampling hypothesis. Just how many high-risk areas there are may possibly dictate what, where and how many samples are taken. It wouldn't be unusual to identify half a dozen suspect areas. Would you recommend 6 ERMIs, or would you rely on air pathways and short distances, taking all contaminants to just 1 or 2 single sample collection points? I must reiterate, this is an IEP standalone assumption. If the medical fraternity were already engaged, discussions on various sampling and testing should have been ratified. Wealthy or sick clients. Yes, an unfortunate fact of life which may influence the type, frequency or type of testing undertaken. With all sampling protocols having benefits and shortfalls, the skill of the IEP will hopefully identify the best approach to contain budget and provide the results required. The most significant question should be, is the survey objective to assist the medical fraternity and influence treatment, or identify contamination exposure routes and/or assist remediation or litigation? Of course, these are separate goals, and simply sampling for contaminants could be very costly and/or possibly worthless without the detailed inspection of the IEP to identify causation. As all components are usually linked, a compromise is often likely, and the best option is mutual benefit by pre-planning with all stakeholders. Sampling will reflect the client's requirement, which are usually misled and misinformed. You can take it that I haven't got an awful lot of sympathy with clients. I've got sympathy, but they really don't know what they want. International opinion is that sampling visible mould is pointless because all mould is a health hazard, either allergenic or potentially toxic or an inflammagen. Does it initially matter if it's Stachybotrys, Aspergillus or penicillin? Whatever it is, it must be removed and the water damage remediated. With most medical treatment focusing on reduction of inflammation or dilution of stored inflammagens, the remediation is likely to be similar. We can now complicate testing hypotheses and blow the budget with next generation sequencing for gram-positive or negative bacteria, actinos, microbial VOCs, endotoxins, culture-based sampling, and of course, ERMI. Of course, HERTSMI-2 and ERMI endotoxin actinos may have significance to the medical profession, but they should qualify and recommend it to the client. The information provided by these and other lab assessments are worthless unless assessed by SIRS specialists and professionals. The reality in this photo shows a clear risk and potential hazard and must simply be remediated, whatever it is. By the way, when I first entered this home, I was called in by the landlord. It was a local authority, and they couldn't understand why there was so much mold. And it was all the height of typical rising damp. When I first went into the house, I was wearing a respirator, but when I saw the family, they were the fittest, healthiest looking people I've ever seen. And one of them was a semi-professional cricketer. It astounded me that people wasn't so sick. I've mentioned the visible mold should not normally or routinely be analysed. If the mold was visible, the client will usually have cleaned it off or got a builder to undertake remediation. The IEP is usually only engaged when the client doesn't know where the mold is or when a medic has suggested their illness may be building or mold related. Let's ignore other forms of testing and focus on ERMI, qPCR, and total spore count. ERMI identifies species, but not source. It relies on air pathways to carry the contamination to the sampling location. Is that potluck? The sampling location can be some distance from the point of origin. And of course, the shape, weight of the spore or fragment will often dictate what is carried in airflow and ends up in the sample. We will see in later slides the variances in two adjacent rooms. Cleaning regimes can also alter ERMI exposure. There is, of course, a reasonable argument that settled dust or particulates can re-aerosolize. But is re-aerosolization an everyday occurrence? If so, how come we always know where to find the settled dust? In fact, the ERMI analysis only provides information on the presence of mold associated with the inflammatory response, not where the contamination originated. Total spore counts measure localized airborne respiratory risk assessments. They measure airborne contamination levels with debris loading and a variety of water damage mold indicators. While total spore counts doesn't differentiate between penicillin and aspergillus, it does identify important water damage genus, such as Cladosporium, Chaetomium, Stachybotrys, Ascospores, which are all potentially toxic and water damage indicators.